woodcraft, helping you make woodwork.
For the delay. Marking and measuring seems pretty simple, and it can be, should be, but it takes practice. You just can't go, I mean, it's a sort of thing a lot of us just kind of figure, well, heck, you just put a tape measure on it, measure it, cut it, and it'll work. Well, a lot of times it's not all that simple. You need some fairly decent tools. You don't have to buy the cream of the crop, but you don't want to have junk either. The stuff has to be decent measurements. You've got to have a consistent technique. Do the same thing every time with the same process. Whatever you're doing, do it like you did last time. If that system works for you, keep it up. And like I say, it just takes practice. After you're doing this for a couple, 3 years, you'll get the gist of it. It can be very simple. You can use something like this. It's called a story stick. You're wanting to know the flatness of this or the levelness of this. All you have to do is put this here, give it a mark, go over to here, wherever you're trying for that height. Simple, everybody's got this kind of scraps. For inside measurements of a box or what have you, you can use, again, a story stick of some sort. A lot of times some of these folding rulers will have an extension. You can put this inside the box, extend that out to whatever it has to be, and then measure. You can do this for, front to back, side to side, just to make sure things are the same. To check square on the inside of a box, you can do the tape measure thing that measure the diagonals, or you can make yourself something like this, which is just a couple of sticks that you extend to fit in the corners. Secure that, and then check the other corner, just to check for square. I used to be an electrician. This little device here is for connecting a ground wire to a ground rod, so they're available. Anyway, it just seemed to be the handy thing for me to use. But this works real well, and it saves a lot of measuring, so just so everything's consistent. Okay. Now, a tool that everybody's got. Now? Okay. Is a tape measure. They're great. They just work. Something you might want to check. Most people in our hobby aren't going to need a 25 or 35 foot tape. You just don't. They're great because they're usually a 1-inch blade, and they're good for standout, for construction work. I use one all the time, but in this hobby you usually don't need anything more than about 12 feet, 16 feet, somewhere around there, and usually less than that. You do have to be careful on these things. If you ever drop them, this little hook here, it's actually got a fair degree of variability. If you drop this thing on this tip and it kinks in, you can lose up to, say, 3/16 of an inch every time you measure something. Granted, it's going to be consistent, but if you're trying to cut something 24 inches wide or long, you're going to end up with a 23 3/16 all the time. This has got to be square. I've known people who, if they ever drop a tape measure, they just pitch it, regardless of whether it landed on that or not. They just pitch it. Good tool. If you do have to measure anything under a foot, I kind of recommend a metal ruler, either that or one of these on the square. It has the advantage of usually finer increments. And you can lay the thing right down on your desk to get whatever measurement you need. The good ones of these have engraved numbers and lines as opposed to being painted on. Go for this is one of the examples of getting a little finer tool. Get something that's etched in. They don't go away even after a lot of use. You're still going to be able to see the lines. Along those same lines, something else. This is basically a ruler. However, it does have it's got a straight edge. This is a milled straight edge. You can check for flatness on this for essentially hand planes. Checking the flatness of the base of a hand plane. Checking. This is a little short to be doing anything with a jointer outfeed and infeed tables, checking level on this, but you can do that. And checking the blade setup. Another example of this is an old metal rule I had from, God knows where I got it. This does not have the extension that other one does that I showed you. But again, same thing. A lot of people prefer these old folding rules to a tape measure. Yet another style. It's an old Stanley, short, but good for most of the size of work that we do. Along rulers again, something like this, little 6-inch, just handy. It's nice and thin. You know where your line's going to be. This can also be used when you're putting on a slight back bevel when you're sharpening a plane or chisel blades, plane blades in particular. You can put your blade on this so it just barely gives you a little back bevel on your sharpening stone. Nothing to do with measuring, but something to do. Let's see. You're all familiar with one of these, just a framing square, good for final squaring up of cabinetry, anything, large surfaces like so, here. There's a lot of times, if you have one of these, they might not be square. You can check that by putting it on a large flat surface such as this, making a small mark here, turning the thing around like so, and this edge should line up with that mark. If it doesn't, you mark down, you mark here and here, and flipping it around, if this thing is square, it will line up with both those marks will line up. If they don't, if this thing proves to be too wide, it's possible to make it contract a little bit, not very much, but a little bit, by taking a punch and putting a couple of dents right here on the inside. If it's too narrow, you put the little punch on the outside here, and it's either going to spring that out or spring it forward. Now that you're not going to be able to do even a 1/16. This is a matter of almost like a 1/64 of an inch that's going to affect that. It's not a lot, but if that's all you have to do, then that's a good way to do it. Okay, if you're doing marking, I don't have an example of a woodworker, a crayon. It's a wood crayon. They're big, fat, waxy things. And your original layout of a board to get the number of cuts that you're going to do. You can use that crayon to mark it with, and they're gross marks. You want every 16 inches you put sort of a mark here, and you put a mark here, and then you put one down the middle. It just gives you a rough idea of how many pieces you can get out of whatever material you're using. It's good for plywood, it's good for long, wide boards, just to mark everything out. I don't mind, I like one of these big fat pencils, essentially for the same reason. They're not for fine tuning or fine marking at all. But again, they're just good for the gross marking out of your piece. When it gets down to finer stuff, there are most of the small pencils, mechanical pencils out nowadays are somewhere around either 5 to 7 millimeters wide. This one I think is 7, which is good for most work. You keep the tip sharp. To get really fine, if you can get a drafting pencil somewhat like this, and this has got a 0.3 lead in it. With something like this, especially if your eyesight is a little, well, deteriorating, it will take a razor mark or a knife mark in a piece of wood, and you can take that 0.3 millimeter pencil, and that will fit right within that knife mark. So it just kind of makes it a little darker, so you can see it a little better. The lead on these things is awfully soft and very brittle, so you can't be doing a lot of pressure. It's going to, the lead goes away pretty rapidly because it is so small. But if you're careful, you can get a real decent fine line and cut right to it. Just a little offshoot, level, pretty mandatory. This one I think was probably used by plumbers because it's got this little screw in here that when brought down, that is like so. So it gives you, plumbers are very concerned with the slope of their drain pipes in particular, and I forget what it is, 1/8 of an inch per foot or something like that. But you can set this on your pipe so that when you have the proper slope, then it's going to read level or up. Anyway, here's the one for that. I picked this up somewhere and it just seemed like kind of a clever little thing. So anyway, not necessary totally for woodworking, but they're handy. Measuring, say, flatness on a board, a long board. They're rarely perfectly flat, especially when you get them. I highly recommend a set of winding sticks. These fit on the ends here and here, and then you sight down you just sight down, and if you can see that far end over this edge. If they're perfectly flat, well then you know your board is good and flat. But if you can see, if it's something like so, you've got a problem. So make sure where you want to start, what's high, what's low, mark that area, run it through your joiner or hand plane work. One way or t'other, you can get rid of that and do that until the tops of those sticks line up, and then you know you're flat. Marking knife, I prefer a knife to use. It just gives you a good fine line as opposed to a pencil. Incra makes a whole series of rules like this. They've all got holes and lines punched in them at every degree. So you've got a 300 in this piece. You've got a 360 degree or 180 degree measurement possibility here. Same sort of thing, just on a small square. These come in different sizes. There's a 12-inch model. Incra makes, well, all kinds. You can take a look at them in the back a little later on, but they make a square that fits over the top of a corner of whatever piece you have, so that you can line out both the top and the side, and so that your lines match. I don't know how many times I have tried to go all the way around a square piece, and by the time you get around trying to match the last two up, you know, you're off an 1/8 or a 1/16. These help. This is the same sort of thing. It just gives you the ability to mark the downside